In the American conservative movement, there is a clear division between your average politician and the broader conservative movement. You know, the pundits, the commentators, and the social advocacy groups, which oftentimes come to define the platform of conservatism, largely will not even interact directly or indirectly with politicians or their staff. Instead, there are many factions within the broader conservative movement who speak directly to the people. However, what separates these factions from the ones discussed by Mr. Z are their isolation from the conservative establishment in politics. These factions are not included in the establishment and are oftentimes not included to sit at the cool kids table at lunch. Whether the reason be their youth and inexperience, their anti-establishment, or just a general kookiness of their figures and ideas. Even if these figures hold high elected offices, there is still something that separates them from the rest of the conservatives. They're unconventional. They break the mold. They are the embodiments of these groups of conservatives that have been excluded from having a big influence in politics. They are challengers to the establishment, and their emerging movements pose a threat to replace that of the establishment. However, they are still emerging. Thus, they're new to this whole political thing, and they don't possess as much tangible political power as the mainstream factions do. But what they lack in political power, they definitely make up for in devout followings. These political factions have gained prominent followings through their utilization of media and messaging and political issues. They are able to utilize their public presence to directly and indirectly influence the public policy. But these guys are still not mainstream. They're emerging factions of the conservative movement. So let's get into breaking them down. Also, this is part 2 of a series published by Mr. Z breaking down the factions of the conservative movement. Mr. Z covered the mainstream factions and their goals and their agenda and their members who push it forward. So if you haven't watched that video, be sure to give it a watch. Link will be in the description and I'll link it right here. So give that a watch. Anyways, the first emerging faction of the conservative movement that we are going to be talking about is the Populist Faction. The root mentality of this faction is a dissatisfaction with the establishment in government, in culture, in politics, in economics, and other forms of public life. This is a faction which fully embraces Trumpism, traditionalism, Christian populism, and WASP ethics, or white Anglo-Saxon ethics. Like libertarians, they're opposed to the establishment, but populists differ in that they seek to offer an alternative to abolishing the government system altogether. Growing up in an era of politics defined by the establishment politics of the turn of the millennium, the far-left policies of Obama, and the restorative policies of Trump, the young paleo-conservative populists seek to fully embrace the Trumpian mentality of making America great again. This faction is fully driven by Trumpism and the intention to make America a country which places an emphasis on its forgotten native people and culture above the corrupt and ideological interests. Additionally, this faction has a strong emphasis on Christianity in its political platforms. Perhaps what differentiates the populists from most of the new right and the national conservatives is age demographics, approach, and a sense of urgency. Most populists being a part of Generation Z and or millennials, many of them find themselves the inheritors of a crumbling nation that they do not recognize. Thus, they seek to create their own political infrastructure in order to catapult their members into the mainstream and shift the Overton window more to the right. The populists embrace a platform of Christianity, traditional values, anti-wokeness, preservation of American culture, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant ethics, anti-immigration, anti-political correctness, anti-wokeness, anti-multiculturalism, anti-feminism, and anti-establishment conservatives. Some key figures in this faction include politicians like Joe Kent, Blake Masters, Doug Mastriano, and Anthony Sabatini. Public figures like Matt Walsh, Will Witt, John Doyle, Elijah Schaffer, Bryson Gray, and organizations like Red Liberty Media, Right Side Broadcasting Network or RSBN, Real America's Voice, and the American Populist Union, now American Virtue. A political slogan that sums up the beliefs of this faction would be, "Tomorrow belongs to Gen Z." That about does it for the first faction of the emerging American right. So let's get into our next faction that we're going to be talking about. And this faction is what I like to call the Outer Ring Conservatives. The root mentality of the Outer Ring Conservatives is a distrust in authority and a regression to familiar and trusted root values. This once was a less defined faction, but grew immensely in membership during the COVID-19 lockdowns due to an increased presence on various internet forums. The Outer Ring Conservatives are largely made up of older Gen X evangelical Christians, largely women, who are devoted supporters of President Trump. This faction is rooted in a sense of paternalism and a duty to protect. Thus, this faction upholds a political platform that seeks to stop human trafficking, secure the southern border, stop crime, and create safer neighborhoods. However, as a result of this faction's distrust for authority, its members tend to place the blame of problems like illegal immigration, crime, globalism, human trafficking, and so on upon supposed collaboration of a global elite class. Like libertarians and paleos, there is an inherent conservatism to this faction, but one obfuscated by delusion. Key figures within this faction include politicians like Marjorie Taylor Greene, Lauren Boebert, John Gibbs, public figures like Alex Jones, Lynn Wood, Steve Bannon, James O'Keefe, and organizations like InfoWars, The Epoch Times, Moms for Liberty, One America News Network, and Project Veritas. So that's the Outer Ring Conservatives. They're a very interesting faction for sure, but you ain't seen nothing yet. The next faction that we're going to be talking about is one I like to call the Tradcons. This is one of the most interesting factions within the emerging right. The root mentality of this faction is a deeper embracing of inherent conservatism that was previously described, but without a defined political outlet. They are vaguely political, but instead try to market their social platforms that translate to adopt very right-wing positions on issues of political matters. In another time and place, this faction might have constituted a monarchist movement of some kind. It's rooted in an inherent rejection of modernity and skepticism towards Enlightenment philosophy, and political practices rooted in liberal revolutions of the late 18th century. They display clear evidence of disillusionment with the establishment, though more so focused on a broad modernist cultural establishment than a political one. Some key positions taken up by this faction are largely focused around a general theme of rejecting modernity and comfort, and embracing traditional living in health, relationships, and lifestyles. The figures in this movement largely oppose seed oils, feminism, sedentary lifestyles, paganism, modernism, astrology, hookup culture, weakness, insecurity, degeneracy, and everything that is a product of the modern age. They tend to favor a regimen of self-help routines and cultural strength, encouraging traditionalism, Catholicism, family, nationalism, masculinity, femininity, going to the gym, eating healthy and getting married, having kids, Christianity, brotherhood. Key figures in this faction include online brands like Carnivore Aurelius, Young Traditionalists, Worth Fighting For, and Trad West. Commentators like Kai Schwemmer, Jordan B. Peterson, Michael Knowles, and organizations like Church Militant, the New Columbia Movement, and many other religious organizations. As well, while not fully aligned with the positions of this faction, key figures like Clarence Thomas, Viktor Orban, and Jair Bolsonaro represent much of this faction's agenda. So that's the Tradcon faction, and the next faction that we're going to be getting into is a little bit more fringe, okay? The next ones that are going to be following are a little bit more fringe, and they see about little to no collaboration with other factions in the conservative movement. The next one that we're going to be talking about is known as the Groypers. Groypers are a faction of hyper-online, disorganized right-wing social groups who follow commentator Nicholas Fuentes and various other streamers on his platform Cozy TV. The faction champions a platform of opposing immigration, political correctness, wokeness, multiculturalism, diversity, feminism, mainstream conservatism, and especially U.S.'s support of Israel. The root mentality of this faction appears to be disillusionment with the establishment, combined with a sort of antisocial outcast mentality and contrarianism, sometimes exhibited by Tradcons and outer ringer conservatives, but with the Groypers it's taken to the extreme. Their antisocial outcast mentality serves as an opposition to the inherent conservatism which would be demonstrable through personal ethic and conduct. However, what separates Groypers from the other factions like the Populist and New Right factions, first is their devotion to Fuentes, but also in the fact that there is more so an active rejection of anything that is deemed normal by this faction. They justify this position by pushing the idea that the established normal is all bad, so far as to extend to socialization. This is seen in the faction often taking pride in their opposition to talking to or dating women, and pridefully calling themselves incels. The following in the Groyper movement, however, is not inherently political, as they take a more indirect approach to red-pilling the young audiences through online video gaming streams, shock humor, irony, online language, and the utilization of modern trends. Much of the political activism championed by this faction is not necessarily surrounding any specific issues or ideology, except a general contrarianism, and instead circle around the promotion of Fuentes and his social circle as commentators. And given that Fuentes has positioned himself as a rival to nearly every other conservative faction, Groypers often do not collaborate with any of the other conservative factions, and have largely isolated themselves as more of a social movement. Key figures in this faction include commentators like Nicholas Fuentes, Michelle Malkin, Stu Peters, Vincent James, Wayne Dupree, and organizations like the America First Foundation, Valiant News, and Cozy TV. As well as not fully aligned with the positions of this faction, there are also established politicians who represent much of the faction's agenda and or have collaborated with them in the past. Politicians like Steve King, Paul Gosar, Laura Loomer, and Janice McGeechan. Okay, we've reached the final faction of emerging right. And this faction is the most fringe faction within the general conservative movement. However, the reason that they're included as a faction is because their faction is usually made up of disillusioned, disquieted members of other conservative factions. This faction is called the Remnants of the Alt-Right. Following the events at Charlottesville, the assortment of groups formerly known as the alt-right were largely disillusioned with one another and failed to consolidate into a single movement. Thus, following the disaster at the Unite the Right rally at Charlottesville, what was known as the alt-right was left highly fragmented among groups who generally advocate for ethno-nationalist positions and or overtly fascistic policy through unorthodox means, including through threats and conflict. While these groups are not key players in actual politics, their presence at demonstrations and even online leave an impact given the nature of their beliefs. The remnants of the alt-right are largely far-righters who saw the presidency of Donald Trump as a disappointment and a failure. Thus, they've become disillusioned with mainstream conservatism as ineffective to fixing the country. These groups are more focused on building independently of any conservative establishment and building their own infrastructure to eventually tear down the establishment and replace it with their own. The root mentality of this faction is based in a rejection of modern establishment across the board and a reverence of the near past as something of a lost opportunity. The movement is chiefly fueled by anger with demographic trends, degeneration of culture, and the decline of the nation. This type of mentality is one of aggressive reaction, fueled by a loss of hope in politics. The movement is broader than the other ones we've talked about and includes more moderate factions intent on raising racial awareness and political discourse rather than merely inflaming them, as well as other groups which aren't properly in line with American conservatism, but simply desire to transform the country for the sake of ideology. These groups have a strong emphasis on brotherhood and solidarity in being separate from the mainstream conservative movement. They are ideologically focused as opposed to promoting membership or modern figures. Instead, they largely look to historical figures in their writings. Figures like Francis Parker Yockey, George Lincoln Rockwell, and William Dudley Pelley. Some key players within the remnants of the alt-right include David Duke, Richard Spencer, Jared Taylor, Mike Enoch, and organizations like Identity Europa, Patriot Front, and the American Identity Movement, American Renaissance, and The Right Stuff. They have no actual politicians that are a part of their faction. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Support the Wolfpack by donating or join by subscribing for more content like this. I'll see you next time, Wolfpack. I push my faith much higher.